attractive an offer do you think that'll be?
Well, hopefully it will encourage employers to think seriously about taking on young workers, and we know that young people have been disproportionately hit by the economic effects of the pandemic, Nick. 2.5 times more likely to work in sectors of the economy that have been shut down. I mean, I think there are a number of things that the government needs to put in place to make sure the Kickstarter scheme is a success. They need to work with employers and unions to make sure these are good quality jobs, that they provide real training opportunities. We'd like to see employers commit to pay the national living wage so that young people have dignity at work and a decent income. But it's a step in the right direction. We know there is a lot more the government needs to do, though, to give the economy the real boost it needs.
You talked about working with the unions. Are they? Are you discovering that this Conservative Chancellor actually is listening to your suggestions?
Well, I think if you think about one of the most important initiatives of the last few months, the job retention scheme, that was a scheme that the Chancellor designed following discussions with the TUC and with the business organisations. I think it was a good example of government working positively with trade unions. We've seen other examples. I mean, I've been involved over the last few weeks in Department of Culture, Media and Sport Task Force, which has been looking at how we open up our galleries, our museums, our theatres. And we saw the boost that the Chancellor announced just this week, £1.5 billion for that sector. I'd like to see that approach rolled out right across the economy. We know there are some sectors under particular pressures, whether it's aviation or hospitality. You pick up the newspapers every day and we're seeing employers announcing redundancies from Pret a Manger to Airbus, from John Lewis to our national newspapers. Now is the time for the Chancellor and the government to engage with unions and employers to think about what specific sector support we need, including more flexibility in that job retention scheme.
Paul Novak, Deputy General Secretary of the TUC, thanks for coming on.
Couple of minutes to 7 to the weather, and Darren back.
Yeah, another cool day today, Justin. Some sunshine across some northern areas, some rain in the south. Across southern England, Wales, the Midlands and eastern England, it's going to be a cloudy, dull day. Some further rain and drizzle from time to time. A little bit misty, some hill fog in Wales and the southwest. And temperatures only 16 to 19 degrees. Move further north into northern England. Quite a mixture here. I think for many places it will be cloudy. But we'll get some sunshine for a while and the odd shower for Cumbria and Northumberland before the cloud thickens later on in the day everywhere and we get some rain arriving in most areas by the evening. Before then, temperatures 16 to 18 degrees. And in Northern Ireland today, a little bit of sunshine this morning before it turns more cloudy, and then we get some rain in the afternoon, more likely in southern parts of Northern Ireland, 16 or 17 degrees here. For Scotland, a really cold start actually across the highlands of Scotland. There'll be a fair bit of low cloud to start the day, but we will see some sunny spells developing. That'll trigger a few sharp showers, particularly over the hills, and quite cool in the afternoon in Scotland. Temperatures no better than 15 or 16 degrees.
Thank you, Darren. Let's hear now about a true story coming to TV tonight.
On BBC Two.
I am not against women working outside the home.
1970s America.
But what I am against is the women's liberation movement.
A battleground like no other.
Our movement is about fighting the oppression of all women.
We do not want housewives thinking that we are against them.
We are against them.
With the Academy Award winner, Kate Blanchett.
This fight is not about equality.
Mrs. America.
We don't get to decide how the battle lines are drawn.
Starts tonight at 9 on BBC Two and iPlayer.
In the next hour on this programme, the President, Donald Trump, has pulled the trigger on the WHO. America will leave it, he says. Is he at least partly right when he accuses it of bad behaviour?
You're listening to Today with Justin Webb and Nick Robinson. Good morning, it's 7 o'clock on Wednesday the 8th of July. The headlines this morning: the Chancellor will set out plans today to boost job opportunities for young people and introduce a temporary stamp duty holiday to stimulate the housing market. President Trump has officially begun the process of withdrawing the United States from the World Health Organization, despite a surge of new infections in many states. A review has found that many women had their lives ruined because officials failed to listen to their concerns about 3 medical treatments. The BBC News is read this morning by Chris Aldridge.
The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is set to announce a £2 billion fund to create more jobs for young people in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. It's the latest in a series of schemes aimed at boosting the UK economy. In a statement to MPs this lunchtime, Mr Sunak will also confirm a temporary stamp duty holiday for home buyers in England and Northern Ireland. Labour has welcomed some of the initiatives, but says the government needs to provide tailored support to groups hit hardest by the crisis. Newsnight's political editor Nick Watt reports.
Nervous cabinet ministers are warning that Britain is on the verge of a dramatic spike in unemployment, which will have a disproportionate impact on younger people. And so today, Rishi Sunak will target help at workers aged between 16 and 24. A £2 billion Kickstart job scheme will help to fund 6 months' work placements for younger workers claiming universal credit who are at risk of long-term unemployment. The measure marks the second stage of his response to the coronavirus crisis. Stage 1 saw the government pay the wages of millions forced to step back from work as large parts of the economy closed down. Stage 2 will see the furlough scheme wound down and more modest help targeted at key sectors of the economy to move people back to work. Ministers talk about nudging the economy, and so there will be a temporary stamp duty holiday to stimulate the property market. This will exempt the first £500,000 of all property sales from the tax. There may also be moves towards a temporary cut in VAT to help the hospitality sector.
The Unite Union has urged Rishi Sunak also to take action to support the car industry, following the announcement that more than 2,000 jobs could be lost in Jaguar Land Rover's supply chain. The logistics firm DHL, which delivers parts to Jaguar's factories in the Midlands and North West England, is blaming highly challenging trading conditions. Donald Trump has given formal notice that the United States will leave the World Health Organization next year, despite soaring rates of COVID-19 around the country. Almost 3 million cases have now been reported across the US, while a record 60,000 new infections were confirmed yesterday. Here's our North America correspondent, David Willis.
As well as repeatedly condemning its response to the coronavirus pandemic as inadequate, President Trump has accused the World Health Organization of being too ready to accept China's explanations for the spread of the infection. But some health experts fear the move to withdraw from an organization the United States had a central role in creating could have a profound effect on the WHO's work and might even call into question its future financial viability, because the US constitutes a major source of its funding. President Trump is not alone in questioning the WHO's initial response to the coronavirus, but the timing of this announcement is nonetheless unusual, coming just as the US is seeing a sudden surge in COVID-19 cases. Amongst its many other tasks, the WHO is currently coordinating trials of possible treatments for the virus, as well as the search for a vaccine.
American newspapers have published excerpts from a book by Donald Trump's niece in which she describes him as a lying narcissist who was shaped by his domineering father and who saw cheating as a way of life. Mary Trump, who's a clinical psychologist, claims that Mr. Trump paid someone else to sit his pre-college SAT exam, which helped him get into a prestigious business school. The White House has dismissed this claim as completely false, while the president has said the whole book is fiction. BBC News understands that the government's new coronavirus monitoring unit is to take on some of the work of the scientific advisory group SAGE. The Joint Biosecurity Centre will play a greater role in trying to understand the spread of COVID-19, while SAGE will meet less frequently. Our science correspondent Palad Ghosh has more details.
A slimmed-down SAGE will continue to look at longer-term concerns such as immunity to the virus and the impact of winter. But it will now be the JBC's job to do more of the scientific heavy lifting to keep the public safe. The centre was formed in May, and it helps the UK's chief medical officers set the threat levels in each of the 4 nations. The centre is also developing clever new ways of identifying an outbreak before it happens. These would include proactive testing in high-risk areas, looking at absentee rates, and analysing environmental indicators of infection levels among the local population, such as wastewater.
The border between the Australian states of New South Wales and Victoria has been closed for the first time in 100 years because of a surge of COVID-19 cases in Victoria's state capital, Melbourne. The city's 5 million residents have been out in force shopping before the start of a 6-week lockdown beginning later today. Thousands of protesters have clashed with riot police in the Serbian capital Belgrade after the government announced a weekend curfew in the city in response to a rise in coronavirus infections. At one point, crowds stormed the Parliament building. This report from Grant Ferret.
Demonstrators surged through crowd control barriers and into the Parliament in Belgrade. Hours earlier, President Aleksandar Vučić announced a weekend curfew as well as a ban on all public gatherings of more than 5 people. The protesters were forced out by police equipped with batons and shields. But many remained on the streets late into the night. They demanded the resignation of the president, accusing him of mishandling the crisis.
A highly critical review of 3 medical treatments for women in the UK says thousands of lives may have been harmed because officials failed to listen to safety worries and often dismissed them as women's problems. It examined responses to concerns about the hormone pregnancy test, Primodos, sodium valproate, a drug for epilepsy, and the pelvic mesh surgical treatment. The review concludes that women and their families were let down by a culture of denial in a disjointed and defensive healthcare system. The review makes a series of recommendations, including appointing an independent patient safety commissioner. Its chairwoman is Lady Cumberledge.
We will be working our socks off to make sure these recommendations come about. I am with this for a very long time. I recognise that. I have heard these stories. I will take them to my grave. I can't abandon these women.
The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, says the government is listening.
I want to issue a full apology to those who've suffered and their families for the frustration, for the time that they've taken to get their voices heard, and now their voices have been heard. It's very important that we learn from this report.
A network of giant high-altitude balloons has started providing internet access to remote areas of Kenya. It's the first commercial deployment of the technology by Google's sister firm Loon. Jane Wakefield reports.
The project was announced 2 years ago, but the final sign-off from the Kenyan government has only just been given. Loon said it was now being fast-tracked to improve communications during the coronavirus pandemic. The balloon's 4G internet service will initially cover a region spanning 50,000 square kilometres and in tests offered download speeds of 18 megabits per second. Eventually, 35 balloons will be in constant motion in the stratosphere above eastern Africa. They are launched in the US and navigate to Kenya using wind currents. Critics have suggested it would have been better to launch in a different country, as Kenya already has 39 million out of a population of 48 million online.
Jane Wakefield reporting.
Thank you, Chris. It's now 9 minutes past 7. There'll be no red box held aloft on Downing Street today, no list of economic forecasts or changes to the duties on booze or fags. What the Chancellor will deliver when he stands up in the House of Commons this afternoon will not be his budget, but it will matter just as much. Rishi Sunak has already spent billions paying the wages of those whose jobs were frozen by the lockdown. Now he has to try and find a way of slowing the surge in unemployment, which is expected once the furlough or job retention scheme is wound down. Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies will be watching him and his measures as closely as ever. Morning to you.
Good morning.
Let's go through each of the things that we know he's going to announce. The first is what I guess you could call a free labour scheme, effectively saying to bosses, you employ a young person on the minimum wage and we'll pay.
Yeah, I think the idea is they'll pay up to 25 hours a week for 6 months for young people under the age of 25 who have been on universal credit. It's actually extremely similar to a scheme that the last Labour government ran during the last crisis called the Future Jobs Fund, which was pretty effective in terms of what one can tell from the evaluations. This will encourage employers to take on those most at risk, actually, the young who have been out of work for a while. There are risks, of course, that you'll take on a 24-year-old and 25 and 26-year-olds who you might otherwise have taken on might suffer. You might be creating sort of jobs that aren't really jobs, pushing other people out of work. But I think as a response to what looks like a big increase in youth unemployment, this is the sort of scheme that you would have expected to have been put in place.
Now, another initiative we're told is a VAT cut, temporary again, trying to persuade us to spend. How does that compare with schemes we've seen in other parts of the world where people are literally given money, or at least vouchers, to help them to spend in shops?
Well, I think the question here is whether you think, particularly if you're looking at the hospitality sector, is the problem that there's lots of spare space in the restaurants that people are at the moment not going to, or is it that people are too scared to go and we want to encourage them in? I don't think we actually know the answer to that right now. So I thought it seems to me that I would have left a scheme like this for a little while to see which of those is the problem, because one of the problems is actually a supply constraint. If you're going to go for a meal, there are half as many or fewer than half as many tables to sit at as there were 3 or 4 months ago, and it may be actually that encouraging more people to go may create more problems than it solves. I mean, all of that said, these are of course the sectors which are hardest hit, and encouraging getting some more money into those sectors can only help the firms.
What then about a boost to the housing market? We're told that stamp duty is going to go for house purchase at under £500,000. I thought policymakers had spent decades saying we've got a problem, our housing market has prices too high, and the last thing we want to do is encourage them up again.
Well, we do want to encourage activity in the housing market. Stamp duty is a dreadful tax which reduces turnover in the housing market altogether, and turnover over the last several years has been low. It's been terrible, obviously, over the last few months. Frankly, I'd rather have seen a long-term abolition of the entire tax. In the short run, it probably will, particularly if it's a temporary scheme, it will probably increase the number of people buying properties, and lots of other things go along with buying a property, buying all the things that you need for a new house, possibly getting builders and decorators in and so on. So as a temporary boost to the economy, it's not a badly targeted tax. The issue is how long it goes on. Once you withdraw it, obviously things calm down quickly potentially, and we don't know what the right point is now to start withdrawing that kind of scheme.
So let's end, Paul, on the big picture. For year after year, you and I have sat in studios and we've talked about black holes, that the Chancellor can't make his numbers add up, and yet here we see a man, to mix our metaphors terribly, seeming to find the magic money tree. How?
Well, part of the answer to how is because he doesn't have any choice. I mean, right now, the economy is in such a position that the only sort of actor in the economy is the government, who can help us through the current phase and can help to get the economy back on its feet again. He's going to be worrying about the cost of all this, but he's not going to be worrying about it this year and possibly not next year, but in 2 or 3 years' time, partly because the economy will be smaller than we expected and tax revenues will be lower, and partly because I think significant chunks of this extra spending will be permanent. At some point he's going to have to come back and pay for this, and at that point Santa Claus, Chancellor Sunak, is going to turn into something the reverse and perhaps become rather less popular.
One thing that will not change is Paul Johnson will be there to analyse the figures. Thanks very much indeed, Paul.
And it's past 7. Is Donald Trump right to take America out of the World Health Organization? He announced last night that was what he intended to do. There's a notice period, so the actual departure doesn't seem to take place until potentially after there is a new administration, but it is plainly a very serious move. And Dr. David Nabarro is the WHO's Special Envoy on Covid-19. We've talked to him many times. He's also Professor of Global Health at Imperial College London. Morning to you.
Good morning. How do you do?
Your reaction first to what Donald Trump has said. Hello, Dr. Navarro, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, jolly good. Well, I couldn't then, but I think we can now. So, yeah, I was saying your initial reaction to what you hear from Donald Trump.
Yeah. The world is facing the most extraordinary...
no, this doesn't sound to me as if it's a line that we can live with. Let's pause for just a moment. Dr. Nabarro, if you can hear me, what we're going to do is redial you. We might even use a thing called a telephone that you may have heard of, and then if that works, we'll talk to you in a second. Nick.
That's a sort of radical measure that's required in a crisis like this. The phone. It is 7:15. Let's hear more now about the Chancellor's big scheme to subsidise jobs for young people. Dominic's here.
Well, let's find out what employers make of the Chancellor's plan. Burger King is a big employer of young people, and Alistair Murdoch is the Chief Executive of Burger King UK. Mr. Murdoch, good morning. What do you think of this idea, subsidised job places for 6 months for young people?
Yeah, good morning, Dominic. Yes, inherently, with obviously with the caveat of not understanding the scheme or the detail behind the scheme. Schemes like this have got to be, a good thing. The more youth that we can keep at work, the better it is. It's very difficult for all of us at the moment.
Might there not be a temptation for employers like you and, of course, your franchisees just to replace your existing workforce with a cheaper one?
No, I mean, that there could always be unscrupulous behaviour, but I would feel fairly confident within our own system that we wouldn't see that kind of behaviour going on, and we would clearly watch out for that. But I don't see that as being such a challenge.
And also, I guess you need it to try and dovetail whatever the Chancellor announces with your existing training schemes. That will also be a question for employers.
Yes, and one of the problems that one has in hospitality has been around, if you take, for instance, the apprenticeship scheme that has been out there, it's been very difficult to fit into organisational hospitality-based training schemes. So again, that's something that requires a lot of time and thought, both on our side and the government side, for sure.
What else would you like to hear from the Chancellor today? Perhaps assistance on business rates, more assistance on business rates, and perhaps rent payments?
Yes, I think, any further deferral on business rates will be very welcome. I think another sort of cash flow challenge could be, we've had VAT deferred until the end of March next year. If that could be sort of pushed out another 2 or 3 months, sort of, gradual payment, again, that would help significantly. And rents, I think, the government have tried hard with their code of conduct, but what I see is that landlords hardened their stance in the last few weeks, and I think the challenge with rents and us not being able to find agreements and compromises with landlords is that we, over time, will actually see it will be to the detriment of the high street, as more retailers will go through processes or partial processes such as administrations.
Thank you very much. Alistair Murdoch from Burger King UK. A little bit of breaking news before I go. Boohoo, the online fashion retailer that's been in hot water over its alleged use of sweatshops in Leicester, says this morning that it's going to commission an independent review of its UK supply chain. It'll be led by Alison Levitt, QC.
Dom, thank you. 18 minutes past 7. We were talking a few minutes ago, at least I was, about Donald Trump's decision to take America out of the World Health Organization. Dr. David Nabarro was as well, but we couldn't hear him. He is, of course, the WHO's special envoy on COVID-19. He's also Professor of Global Health at Imperial. And I was asking Dr. Nabarro what your initial reaction was when you heard the news from Donald Trump.
I'm just really sad because the world is facing a massive health crisis. It's been extremely bad for the last 6 months. I fear it's going to get much worse in the next 6 months. We've still got a lot to find out about this virus and how to deal with it. And it just seems really unfortunate that the most important, in terms of size of the WHO budget, the most important country has decided to pull out. And I'm really sad, really also for the American people, who I'm sure, by and large, want to be part of the global response and will be a bit confused about why this has happened.
What practical impact will it have?
Well, it will have, obviously, a budget impact. The World Health Organization is underfunded. It runs on 1/3 of the budget of the United States Centers for Disease Control, and it's working flat out. But the more serious issue is that all world leaders and all world nations must work together to deal with this virus. And to have the US somehow pulling out is just not, frankly, what the world's people need.
But I suppose that is the point that defenders of Donald Trump and those who are in a wider community of people who are a bit suspicious of the WHO would say, is that actually all nations are not involved, and specifically Taiwan. And there is no question, is there, that Taiwan warned about COVID, warned about the new coronavirus at the turn of the year, and the warning was not taken seriously by the WHO, and crucially not passed on to others, and that was because of China.
Yes, well, first of all, the decision about whether Taiwan or anybody else is a member of the WHO is nothing to do with the WHO and its staff. It's all to do with the people who run the WHO, and they're the countries of the world. And they elect each year about whether or not Taiwan or others are members. Super important, everybody knows that. Secondly, the communications with the people of Taiwan and the institutions in Taiwan by the WHO are in no way affected by this, and there has been regular correspondence between them.
Really? But just on that point, that's a terribly important point, because what the Taiwanese say is that they issued a warning and no notice was taken of it.
Yes, that's what's said, but I'm telling you very clearly that the communications with the people from Taiwan, as with others at the beginning of this, were perfectly open, and that has to be understood very clearly. This is not an issue where people in Geneva are somehow deciding to exclude certain parts of the world from the organisation. They are international civil servants, people like me. We just work for one thing, and that is for world health. And all this talk about Taiwan or the talk about favouritism to one country or the other, that's nothing to do with the WHO.
Nothing to do with the WHO, I'll accept that. And let's face it, there are other international organisations that are desperately affected by international politics and would possibly like to do their jobs very differently. But would you accept at least, even if it's not the WHO's fault, that it does have an impact?
Well, of course, in the international system, you operate between vast numbers of interests of different countries. Nobody's going to say that somehow the international system is free of any kind of push and pull. That's what normal life is, and I'm absolutely not going to sit here and say to you there isn't influence here or there. But the point that has to be really clearly said to everybody is that the people inside the WHO do not sit and have favourite countries. They deal with the issues as they come up and as best they can. Right. And this is a huge issue and needs every country involved. And so that's why all of us are involved in World Health. And on the substance of the issue, if we're slightly running out of time, Dr. Nabarro, can I just put to you this business of airborne transmission? Got a group of scientists now writing to the WHO, obviously worried that we are, all of us, focusing perhaps a little too little on airborne transmission. What do you make of it with your Professor of Global Health hat on? Thanks very much indeed. In the kind of work we do, we have to tell people what is the major cause of a problem, and then we always have to be clear that there may be other causes that are less important. The major way in which this virus is transmitted is through droplets that come out when you cough, sneeze, or even shout. But there does seem to be a possibility that very small particles containing virus can move further, and that's what we call airborne spread. It certainly is part of the puzzle. The key question is just how important is it? And right now, we think it's not the major means of transmission. The major means of transmission is droplets, which is why we talk about 1 to 2 meters distance as being the key thing to avoid spread. Dr. David Nabarro, thank you very much.
At 23 minutes past 7, let's continue to talk about the coronavirus, because the discovery of a vaccine would be very good news, wouldn't it? Well, if you're human, it would be. Much less so if you're a horseshoe crab. That is because the blood of the horseshoe crab is used to make vaccines safe. Environmentalists want to avoid a practice which already involves hundreds of thousands of crabs getting milked or bled each year. I've been speaking to Dr. Barbara Brummer of she's the New Jersey State Director for Nature Conservancy. I asked her how it works.
It was determined a number of years ago that the factors that are in the blood of horseshoe crabs react very strongly with any endotoxins, that's materials from bacteria, and form a clot. And you would say, well, why is that important? The fact of the matter is, when you develop a vaccine, in order to test for sterility, the FDA here in the U.S. requires that you do an endotoxin test. And that endotoxin test uses the blood of horseshoe crabs. And
that means that hundreds of thousands of them are harvested now?
Right now, they bleed about 500,000, 500,000 horseshoe crabs. They collect the blood, and then they return the crabs to the water. When they are put back, they're alive, but nobody really knows the impact that withdrawal of blood has on the life of that crab. Right?
So a new global vaccine would mean a huge increase, presumably, in the number of crabs that were needed and the impact there'd be.
Well, if you think about it, there are at least 30 companies, I believe, working on a vaccine, and every one of them has to go through a lot of sterility testing. And so my concern is about the population of the horseshoe crabs, because they're such a key part of the ecosystem in terms of feeding things like shorebirds. Shorebirds like red knots